So good evening and welcome to the Transformative Visions, the presidential speaker series that over the next 2 months will host visionaries who have imagined the struggles to create a just future. There are 4 visionaries who are part of this fall series at Niagara University. Dr. Wayne I.A. Frederick, who you just met, president of Howard University, is our inaugural speaker for this series. 3 additional conversations will take place in October and November. Dennis McDonough, former White House Chief of Staff, will speak on politics, climate change, and foreign policy in a fireside chat on October 13th. Sophia Elijah, Executive Director of the Alliance of Families of Justice, and the first Black woman to serve as Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York, will speak on criminal justice, policing, and prisons on October 24th. And then on November 17th, Dina Giallo-Whitaker, Policy Director and Senior Research Associate at the Center of the for World Indigenous Studies and lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, will be speaking on environmental justice and indigenous resistance. Each of these individuals, Dr. Frederick tonight and others in the coming weeks, are gifted leaders and have to offer the best in American society, as each has imagined and struggled to create a just future. The idea behind these 4 presentations unfolded in a conversation between Professor Riley, Chair of Political Science, Professor Hinckley, a faculty member in political science, and Father James J. Marr, the current president of Niagara University. It's the hope of both Professor Riley and Hinckley, and it is the hope of our president that Niagara University's Transformative Visions series offers our students and the broader NU community a model of inquiry, discourse, imagination, and action from visionaries who seek to transform the world to a more just and equitable place. So we thank you, Dave and Kevin and Father Marr, for the time and effort given to create this timely and compelling series at Niagara. As the 2020 US presidential election approaches, the major party candidates have attempted to define the issues, for better or worse, to offer a vision of how they would seek to transform America and the world. Today, campaign promises, campaign pronouncements are captured in sound bites that prevent intellectual engagement, thoughtful reflection, or nuanced understanding of a litany of incredibly complicated issues confronting our nation. And as Election Day approaches, we can expect to see and hear bold statements about defining issues of our time and the power of the people to chart our future. Here at Niagara, we believe that education and the sharing of complex ideas to pursue a just society is the only path forward. Please know, Niagara University draws its inspiration from St. Vincent de Paul, who organized his contemporaries to respond compassionately to people's basic needs. Continuing in this tradition, tonight and going forward, as always, we seek generally as at NU and specifically with this series to inspire our students to serve all members of society, especially the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed in our local communities and the larger world. So thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for joining us on the Zoom platform. I hope you find this evening to be inspirational as well as educational. And prematurely, thank you, Dr. Frederick.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ireland. My name is Kevin Hinckley. I'm an assistant professor of political science and director of the pre-law advisement program at Niagara University. On behalf of our president, Father Marr, and the entire Niagara University community, it is my great honor to introduce the inaugural speaker in the Transformative Visions series, the president of Howard University, Dr. Wayne A.I. Frederick. Dr. Frederick has described himself as a true son of Howard University. As an undergraduate, Dr. Frederick completed his Bachelor of Science and his medical degree in a total of 6 years, graduating from Howard University's acclaimed College of Medicine at age 22. Dr. Frederick would later earn his MBA from Howard University's School of Business. Trained as a surgeon and fellow in surgical oncology, Dr. Frederick serves as the distinguished Charles R. Drew Endowed Chair of Surgery at Howard. And amidst his hectic schedule as university president, he continues to treat patients. Dr. Frederick's medical research focuses on narrowing racial, ethnic, and gender disparities in cancer care outcomes and in U.S. healthcare more broadly. In addition to serving as the president of the nation's leading historically Black university, Dr. Frederick is a national expert on disparities in healthcare and medical education, as well as salient topics in higher education, such as the impact of historically Black colleges and universities, campus intellectual diversity, and gender equity on college campuses. Dr. Frederick's extraordinary life and career exemplify Howard University's motto, truth and service. Dr. Frederick, we are profoundly grateful for your pursuit of the ideals of truth and service, and for your transformative vision of justice and equity in education, in healthcare, and in all facets of American life. We are honored to welcome you to Niagara University.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that very kind introduction. I am going to show some slides. As I said, I have too many slides, and I think the biggest value in this is in a question and answer. First, let me thank you again for your very kind invitation. You have an august group of speakers you will hear over the course of a couple of months, and I'm humbled to be among them. We are living in some different times, but times that also, I think, provide us with an opportunity to be more communal and to be more engaged with one another. And hopefully after tonight's talk, you will share some of my position on that issue. So I will share my screen. Can everybody see that? So if somebody can raise their hand to confirm that they can see the slides. Yep, all right, thank you very much. So I'm gonna talk about, primarily speak about unconscious bias in the US in general, but primarily in academia. But I'm gonna use academia as an example for that. Now, I'll start with what academic medicine looked like in the past. Abraham Flexner, who some of you may have heard of, was a gentleman who traveled through the US and Canada to do a report that was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation to look at medical education. So he went to every single medical school in the US and in Canada, did a very thorough report that influenced the outcome of medicine. And the reason that he did it was because people were concerned that the people who were going to medical school were not prepared. And these are some of the things that he wrote in his report. And I actually read this report in its entirety because I was curious about what it said. Entrance requirements and adherence to them was not consistent. The size and training of the faculty was something that he felt needed to be looked at. Relationships between the school and its associated hospitals was problematic. So his intent was to reduce the physician supply and also to ensure that people were better trained. So if you look at what happened at that time, it resulted in the reduction of medical schools by 31. the percentage of schools requiring 2 years of college for admission rose from 3 to 92. So clearly, a lot of the things that he recommended, people followed. What was problematic is that in that very same report, there were other things that he mentioned that I found problematic. It is clear that women show a decreasing inclination. The 7 medical schools for Negroes should be reduced to 2. Blacks, being a potential source of infection and contagion, need to have their own physicians. Hygiene, rather than surgery, should be strongly accentuated in these groups. Now, mind you, I'm a surgeon, and as a result, I would have been one of those that he would have decreased opportunity for. By 1923, as I said, only 2 medical schools for Blacks remained in this country. And between 1920 and 1964, less than 3% of students entering American medical schools were Black. And unfortunately, that is still the case today. But like everything else I hope you get from this lecture is that most issues and most people in life are not one-dimensional. It turns out that when I became president, I went into the bosom of this building here, which is our founders library, the signature building on our campus. And you would notice immediately that it was fashioned after Constitution Hall in Philadelphia. This gentleman right here, Abraham Flexner, actually was a member of Howard University's Board of Trustees from 1930 to 1936. So you can imagine my consternation when I discovered that. I was thinking that this person did the worst thing for Blacks in medical school, and yet still he served on the Board of Trustees and even served as the chairman, and also was partly responsible for getting some of the funds to build this very, very auspicious library. And so I will talk about unconscious bias, but I'll remind all of us that it exists in all of us. And when I first read his report, I did develop a bias about him and his thoughts. And then when I discovered that my alma mater was stood up by him in terms of his support on the board, I certainly had to question how I felt. So academic medicine is very complicated today, but as a result of Flexner, you can see what happened in terms of the number of female applicants and what happened in terms of that gap. That gap has closed significantly. It has started to widen again and has started to close again, but he certainly affected the number of women who went to medical school. As I mentioned before, the number of African Americans who go to medical school, this number has actually decreased over time, and that is problematic. What is unique about Howard University is that the first faculty members in Howard University's College of Medicine back in 1870 included 2 Black men, Augusta and Purvis. And that was one of the unusual things about Howard. It started as a university for the training and education of freed slaves moving from the South. And that commitment went all the way to the faculty. Howard was also a pioneer in terms of bringing women to the faculty. So our historically Black colleges and universities are an important part of the fabric of America today. There are roughly over 300,000 students who attend these schools. They represent about 4% of all 4-year institutions, but they produce 21% of all of the bachelor's degrees awarded to African Americans in this country. Interestingly enough, when you look in STEM fields in particular, they produce about 28% of the degrees given to African Americans, and some 34% when you look specifically in the areas of physics, chemistry, astronomy, mathematics, and biology. And then of the top 10 colleges whose African American graduates went on to get PhDs in science, 8 of that top 10 are from HBCUs, and you can see Howard there. What's remarkable about this, and depending on the audience I'm giving this talk to, I alter this slide, but Howard actually, over this period of time, sent more African Americans to STEM PhD programs than Stanford, MIT, Harvard, and Yale, all of whom are on this list. But those 4 institutions combined sent less African Americans than Howard University to STEM PhDs. To put that in perspective, the combined total of the endowment of those 4 institutions is almost $100 billion to Howard's $750 million. So schools with the biggest resources are not necessarily carrying our societal burden. So how does bias show up? Bias can take place in many forms: sexism, racism, elitism. There's specialty bias. When I was training, surgeons were treated differently than internists. You have conscious and unconscious bias. You have people that specifically develop a bias that they're fully aware of and committed to. But you have way more bias that is way deep in us that we don't always recognize. And so this is an example of that bias. Edward Cornwell is the chair of surgery here at Howard University, but he partnered, and he used to be the head of trauma at Johns Hopkins. He partnered with a group there to write this paper that's in the Journal of the American Medical Association, looking at unconscious implicit race and class bias among first-year medical students. The hypothesis was that, like the general population, doctors may possess unconscious or implicit biases that may lead us to unknowingly treat patients differently. Now, you have to think that first-year medical students, especially before their first day of classes, are probably the most altruistic people in the world. And so they looked at those classes from entering in 2013 and 2014, and they basically gave them some tests and some clinical vignettes. This is the one that I want you to focus on. To the left, you have a white toll booth operator, and to the right, you have a Black attorney. And the question that was posed to this group of students was, which one of these men is more capable of signing an informed consent? And overwhelmingly, the answer was the white toll booth operator, not the Black attorney. And I want us to be very cognizant of the fact that these are very, very altruistic young people. I know the day before I started medical school, I felt I was going to save the world. And I'm sure that the average medical student feels that way. Yet still, embedded in them was that bias. There were 211 total participants, 52% of whom were female. 202 completed the entire survey. And as you can see, this is the breakdown of them. 53% of them were white, 30% Asian, 6.4% of them African American. The age distribution, as you would imagine, for incoming medical students. And you can see that on explicit versus implicit race preferences, there was certainly an issue with respect to how they felt about certain races when you compare Black and white. So the point here is that implicit racial preferences are present. The one good thing that this showed is that it did not necessarily affect clinical decision-making. And so that means that there's potentially hope. Because when they looked at lower versus upper class, again, although there was an implicit bias for that, there still was not necessarily a bias towards treating people differently, but there clearly was risk there. And so a majority of medical students exhibit an unconscious bias, preferring whites and upper social class. And unlike data on physicians, however, these biases do not impact their assessment of surgical patients. So they still are more likely to do the right thing. So why do we need transformative visions, as this series mentions? The coronavirus pandemic has had a destabilizing effect on our country: mass deaths, economic devastation, widespread protests. But the pandemic has also brought into the open the challenges confronting our country. The disproportionate impact on African Americans is primarily related to the fact that we have structural racism that has stood up major institutions in our society in a way that they do not serve everyone equally. And so we must see this crisis as an opportunity for progress. Now, the process for that change is complicated. We must identify the problems and be very honest about it. We must determine why they exist, understand why they persist, because in a lot of circumstances, we already know that they exist, and we have to figure out how they can be fixed. Now, what exactly are those challenges? There's a lack of economic opportunity for Black Americans that surrounds a variety of things, not the least of which is probably lack of educational opportunities that everyone could be equally can equally access. Negative health outcomes. You can't create intergenerational wealth if you don't live as long as someone else. Here in the District of Columbia, there are 8 wards. This is a very small city. And yet still, if you live in wards 7 and 8, where it's 95% predominantly Black, your life expectancy as a Black male is almost 20 years less than if you lived in Ward 3, that is 95% white. And that right there tells the whole story. Here in the nation's capital, you have that wide an outcome in terms of life expectancy. So if I live 20 years less than my counterpart, and you use Warren Buffett's compound interest, I'm never going to be as wealthy, and I'm not going to have the opportunity to pass that on as well. But all of those challenges are interconnected, and we must recognize that as well. Investing in diversity and inclusion is critical, and Howard is trying to lead the pursuit of a just, equitable, and sustainable healthcare system. But I would argue that that starts with introducing more Black doctors into the profession. We are also developing more Black PhDs, as you saw earlier, but we do that for business leaders, researchers, scientists. And Howard is an amazing place for that reason. No credit to me, but credit to what I have inherited as the president of this august institution. If you look at Harvard's MBA program over the past 50 years, the #1 supplier of African Americans to that institution for MBA was Harvard undergrad campus. However, #2 was Howard University. So what we must look at is how can we reform education? We have to do more to improve the pipeline of Black students into our medical schools, without a doubt. And we must improve K-12 education. So on our campus, we actually have a middle school that started back in 2008. And that middle school, started back in 2005. That middle school, which has been around for 15 years, sends 96% of its students to college. 60% of them attend and do a STEM discipline. Now, what is amazing is if you were to meet one of those students on my campus and ask them where they go to school, they'll tell you, I go to Howard University. They will not say to you, I go to Howard University Middle School for math and science. And that's because they get really inoculated in the culture of being on a college campus. It demystifies the opportunity to attend and participate in a higher education. So we must ensure that our students in medical fields and other industries have equal access and opportunity. I think it is key. And just as I was describing my story before we started, at the age of 3, my grandmother gave me the single thing that educators can give to students that will change their lives forever, will transform their lives, and that is confidence. Once you instill confidence in a young boy or young girl, it will go a long way in making them realize their dreams. Reducing bias is also important. So we have to do things to make sure that we're clear. When I started at Howard University as president, only one of my deans was a woman of the 13 schools and colleges. And so I insisted that every time we do a dean search, we would have a gender balanced committee, and everybody had to go to unconscious bias training, as well as cultural competency training. And my insistence for that was to ensure that everyone recognized that we all have an issue that we needed to address. And everybody went kicking and screaming because we're here at Howard. Most of us look like each other. We're part of the class that is being oppressed. And sure enough, everybody who has gone to that training has come back and said they absolutely did not realize they had that many unconscious biases. And as a result, we got all the way up to having 10 women deans as a result. So it's very important that we take leadership roles in trying to change what we must. But there are reasons for optimism. And as a doctor, I see that. My mentor, Dr. LaFall, had a saying that the most important thing you can give to a patient is hope, the anticipation of tomorrow. And the one thing that we must all remember is that we have an opportunity for hope. And right now, the caravan to justice that Howard University has been on for the past 153 years has now been joined by lots of people. They joined in the civil rights movement. We must also recognize that they may also go away. And so Howard University is committed to see the end of this journey, which is nowhere close, but we are committed to seeing the end of the journey. And so we appreciate people joining. We have to get them to stay with us and to stay committed to seeing this through. And that protest movement is really moved by young people who are doing the right things around recognizing what we must do for one another. We've seen tremendous medical advances. This issue around a vaccine, while it has become politicized, is one of the greatest hopes of this entire situation. And the reason for that is the collaboration that I have seen among my colleagues has been unprecedented. And if we took the politics out of a vaccine, we would recognize that getting a vaccine this quickly is one of the greatest things that this country would have ever done. But it came from that type of open collaboration and coming together for the good of all. And we must recognize that we should do that. So Howard University specifically has really gone about trying to make a significant difference. Back in May, we stood up a testing site in Ward 7 and 8, where we have a practice. And as I told you before, it's 95% African-American. We decided that you did not have to be symptomatic. You didn't have to pay for it. It was totally free. And you didn't have to have an exposure. We felt it was important to demystify testing and to make sure that everyone had access. And it was a significant success. Bloomberg Philanthropies, just back on September 3rd, announced that they would give $100 million to support Black doctors. Every medical student at Howard will get up to $100,000 towards their medical education to decrease their debt. And the purpose for that is to allow them to then create intergenerational wealth by leaving Howard University without debt. These types of gifts are important in changing the dynamics that have been upon us before. Also, I wrote a New York Times article with a few of my colleagues talking about the fact that we had to lead around the issue of a vaccine and vaccine trials. We will launch a vaccine trial here at Howard next week, a phase 3 trial. And we have to be at the forefront for trying to convince people in our community to participate. Clinical trials in America usually have 5% or less representation by African Americans. And that has continued to hurt our medical system. It has continued to hurt it to the point that even when we do develop vaccines and other drugs, we often are not sure that they will actually work in minority populations who did not participate. And that actually increases the healthcare system, because what we're then doing is actually doing an open experiment because we did not have the data prior to prove whether or not the drug would work. And so I think it's important as a Black medical school for us to be at the forefront for convincing everyone and getting the trust from them. There are a couple of unique programs here at Howard University that are also important. A middle school of math and science I mentioned to you before, and I think it's very critical for that at that early age to expose students so that they see the opportunity and they can grab it. And it's an opportunity that I think that once they get it, they absolutely do well. I think teacher education is critical. Our School of Education does an excellent job of preparing teachers for tomorrow, but we need to have more diverse teachers in the classroom so that students can relate and students can also aspire to that profession. The doctoral pipeline, as I mentioned before, is critical. We still graduate more African-American PhDs on this campus than any other resident campus in America. Yet still, I am very concerned about that because the numbers is of just over 100. And we are carrying an outsized burden, so we have to do something different. So one of the things that I think is transformative that we've done here was the very BSMD program that I participate in. If we can decrease cost, get students to matriculate more quickly, bring that down, we give them an opportunity. So we have launched beginning this fall, a BA JD program where students will do 3 years undergrad and then go to law school, cutting out at least 25% of their course by not having them do a 4th year in undergrad. We have also started a STEM Scholar program for students who are interested in a PhD in STEM or an MD PhD. And our intent is to bring students in from high school. We now have 90-something of those students. Actually, we had 90-something. This semester, we've now brought in another 30-something. And we have 4 cohorts. And the goal here is to get those students to go from high school into Howard all the way to the PhD in 7 years or less and get both their bachelor's and their PhD. Again, conserving money. These are students who are focused. They know what they want to do. And therefore, I think we can decrease cost and give students an opportunity. We have a dual enrollment program where we have students from high school who are here at Howard University for their junior and senior year of high school, getting credits. We don't charge them. And so they leave here or they continue here having already accumulated college credit, and it puts them again at an advantage and allows them to matriculate through college at a shorter period of time. We've stood up an Office of Undergraduate Studies, which I thought was critical to support students and to make sure they were doing the right things. And so there are several things that we did around making sure students take at least 15 credits, making sure that students did not take classes they didn't need, so they were not doing extra credits. We thought that that was absolutely critical. And we wanted to decrease the number of students who were having academic difficulty. And all of that has proven to be the outcome since we started doing that. But we had to push a little further. We have 46% Pell Grant students at a private institution. And I thought that if we could fill those students' gap, we could probably change their trajectory. So the board allowed me some 5 years ago to give a select number of students who had a zero expected family contribution towards their education what's called a GRACE grant, a Graduation and Retention Access to Continued Excellence grant, and where we filled their entire financial aid package, and so they did not have to worry about finances. And I can tell you today that 91% of those students graduate in 4 years. Their counterparts who did not receive that grant, 61% of them graduated. We improved the graduation rate by 30% for that group of students by removing the financial barrier. So I want you to be optimistic about the future. I love this slide. If you take nothing else away from this talk, I do want you to remember this slide. Equality to the left is the assumption that everyone benefits from the same support system, despite the fact that everyone is not born into an America or migrates into an America on equal footing. And that's an unrealistic expectation. Equity occurs when everybody gets the support that they need. And that essentially is the concept of affirmative action. But I still think that that falls short of our ideal, which is justice. And justice occurs when we remove the barrier from everyone to see. And that's what you see in that last picture. Everyone can see. Everyone does not need additional items and support systems. We just have to remove the barrier, because the stools are just simply surrogates for, or a Band-Aid for what we really need to do, and that is to remove the problem. These three people are my universe. The lady to the left is my mom. She spent 50 years as a nurse. She wanted to go to medical school. My grandfather, who was a lawyer after being a school principal and was a good man, may he rest in peace, taught that women should not become physicians, but should become nurses. And that's why he sent my mother to medical school. She would then have a desire to have 3 sons and pray that one of them would become a physician. And so I owe not just my life to her, but I owe my pursuit of medicine to her and to that story. The gentleman in the middle is Charles R. Drew, who would go on to figure out how we could preserve plasma. On April 1st, 1950, he was teaching a class in which the gentleman to the right, Dr. LaSalle Lafall, was sitting in the front row. And actually that was March 31st, 1950. He taught that class, and then he left to take some residents to North Carolina for a conference. That was in a day of segregation. So they had a specific place that they had to stop at and stay. And so he drove for very long hours, evidently may have fallen asleep at the wheel, drove into a ditch and died. There has been a myth that he bled to death and did not get the care at a white hospital and didn't get the very blood that he needed, that he himself figured out how to preserve. And that is a myth. It's not true. He suffered horrific injuries, and that's why he died. The gentleman to the right, Dr. LaSalle Lafall, was an 18-year-old graduate of Florida A&M College, came to Howard University Medical School because he could not take standardized tests well. He graduated at the age of 18, got 1B on his transcript, but didn't take standardized tests well. His university president petitioned for Howard to admit him. And he would go on to become the first Black president of the American Cancer Society, the American College of Surgeons. But he was sitting in the front row on April 1st, 1950, of his medical school class, as he did every day in medical school, when he overheard a message that Dr. Drew had died tragically. And he would then become the first Charles R. Drew Professor of Surgery, the title that I now hold. The first time I put this talk together, this was my last slide. And this was many years ago. The first time I gave this talk was about 2008. This is my now 16-year-old son, and he'll be embarrassed if he saw me showing this picture. I know definitely my 14-year-old daughter would not be happy if she saw this. There are a couple of important things about this picture I want you to remember. If you look in the background, you would notice that Barack Obama is giving an acceptance speech at the at the Iowa primary. I was trying to get my daughter out of the way so I could listen to the speech. And so I took this picture of her. When I put the slide together, my wife, who is a computer scientist, came into the room and said to me, "Your last slide about unconscious bias has your son dressed up as a surgeon and your daughter dressed up as a cheerleader." So this is now my last slide. And so if you take nothing else away from this, I hope that you recognize that the most important thing that you could get from this is to recognize that unconscious bias exists in all of us. And all of us are the ultimate solution for the problems that plague us today. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frederick, and thank you for offering this vision of optimism and hope, looking at this crisis as an opportunity for growth, for transforming our society in a positive way. In just a moment, we'll invite students in our classroom to pose questions. For those of you who are participating through Zoom, you have the opportunity to pose questions in the chat or in the Q&A. To get things started, I'd like to ask the first question. Dr. Frederick, there's growing evidence that the COVID-19 pandemic has contributed to soaring rates of depression and anxiety, particularly, though by no means exclusively, among young people, including college students. As an educator and a physician, could you speak to what you've observed in this area? And if there is a hidden pandemic of mental illness in America, what, if anything, can be done to address it?
Yeah, I'll probably go one step further. I'll speak to you as a father. My daughter has had a terrible time adjusting. She's very social. She actually asked us, because she's so precocious, to see a therapist. And so she has seen a therapist. She's taking medication now. It's been tough for her to be away from her friends. My father died a month shy of my 3rd birthday. He committed suicide. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm at risk, and my daughter, by such, is at risk. We don't talk about mental health illness enough. We don't talk about it because of the stigma that's associated with it. I have not spoken about my father's suicide publicly. But I think it's important. This pandemic has made it clear to me that there's a lot more challenge around mental health than we recognize and that we want to acknowledge. But we must, because it has been a trying time and it's very, very difficult. And so we have to think of how do we mitigate. As soon as school started back, it was like a light bulb went off for my daughter. She probably joined 7 clubs. Although she's online, she's fundraising for a group. I mean, it's been like night and day. And so we must recognize that this is going to be very, very heavy on our student body. I'm particularly concerned about freshmen in college. They ended their high school without a regular celebration, which is important along your journey. And now they're starting in a very awkward manner as well. And so I think we have to spend more time doing that. So what I have tried to do is to ensure that our students have virtual counseling. We've stood that up. We've been very aggressive about adding more resources to that to ensure that we can do that. And as we think about bringing students back as well, that's going to be another change that's going to be fraught with some difficulty. We have all been isolated to some extent, and we almost have to learn how to be back in the presence of each other. recognizing that we're each a threat right now. I mean, you walk down the street and you see somebody with a mask, and you may be smiling under your mask, but at the same time, you want them to stay 6 feet away. The human condition, the essence of the human condition is interaction. It's not isolation.
Students, please approach the podium.
Hello, sorry. Hello, Dr. Frederick. My name is Matt McKenzie. I'm a senior political science major here at Niagara. And something that I ask a lot of speakers, everyone that I talk to, what are some like resources or things that you read or seen that you think shaped you in your youth? So like, I'm 22 years old, and there's things that I recognize that I've read recently or growing up that have like really affected me and helped me to shape me into the person that I am today.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. You know, I was a vociferous reader growing up, but I will be honest with you, I don't think things that I read really influenced me as much as people that I met and interacted with. And I am very, I gravitate to older people. So, you know, I count amongst my mentors, Vernon Jordan and General Powell as an example. They lived and grew up in a different time, a different era. And I often go and sit at their feet and listen to them. And most young people, I would say, don't quite appreciate the mentor-mentee relationship. It's not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. As mentors, we get as much from you as you think we're giving to you. And I think if you approach those relationships with that, there's a lot for you to get from it. And that's where I think I got most of what transformed me. Dr. LaFord being an example in terms of the way he lived his life and the types of racism and stuff that he was presented with. He served in the US Army and had to sleep in different quarters from his colleagues. He would go to give lectures around the country because he was such a good surgeon, and he would have to stay at different places while doing that. And still, he did it. And sometimes as well, I think some of the bigger lessons as well are from people who you meet through the course of your everyday life. And I think you can't discount that as well. So some of the biggest lessons I've learned come from my patients. You treat patients with cancer, one of the things that's clear is the fact that they have more courage than you'll ever see. And that's one of the things that I'm always touched by. I can't tell you how many times I've left an operating room and gone out to speak to a family and didn't have good news. And those family members would get up and hug me and say, thank you. And just think about that. You give somebody the worst news of their life and they find all the empathy in the world to hug and comfort you. And so I think there are lessons to learn every day, both big and small, but we should not approach interacting with anyone or approach any activity that we do every day with any type of apathy.
Hi, I'm Marin, junior political science major. And so currently I'm interning in the Niagara Falls mayor's office, and part of my duty is going to be and is reviewing reports of individual committees with the goal of creating a collective social justice commission report to issue to the city that'll incorporate recommendations and plans for action. So one of those committees is healthcare. And although I haven't been able to review their report yet, I want to ask you, what kind of things can a municipality, city do in terms of healthcare, and what should their report reflect, as well as the city's overall?
Great. No, that's a great question, for which I'm not going to have a great answer, or I might have a bit of a controversial answer. So, and again, I know the provost is there, so I say this with all good intentions. I know that people stand up a lot of diversity and inclusion committees and offices. I believe that that's the role of the CEO and the president. And so what I would encourage you to do is to tell the mayor that if the mayor believes that that is an issue, then it needs to be, that person needs to take the primary responsibility. If it's that important, that should be that person's portfolio. And so some of the things that you should look for are where are the inequities and why. Sometimes there are cultural norms that we're trying to break. So for instance, here in DC, to convince African Americans to go get a vaccine in a healthcare system that has had an experiment where they gave them syphilis in the past and didn't treat them, those are not things that give people confidence in the system. And so you also have to have people who look like you. And so you have to look at who the population is and make sure that you don't have a one size fits all and that you really are trying to target the things that are important. The second thing is that some of the things that we do today and don't always make sense. So one example is my alum just passed away. Many of you know him as a Black Panther. I call him Chad, and he was Chadwick Boseman. He was my commencement speaker here in 2017. He died of metastatic colon cancer at the age of 42. There's no screening recommendation right now in America that would have saved his life. Yet still, we recognize that minorities are far more likely to get colon cancer at a younger age, which means that we should have more flexible recommendations around screening for patients that have a particular risk. And that's one example of a screening recommendation that I think should be changed, as an example. So I think as you go about it, you want to let the data lead you to where it is. And you also want to recognize that the social determinants of health are just as important. Do people have transportation? The maternal mortality rate in DC, the nation's capital, is higher than many third world countries. And that's because there's nowhere in Ward 7 and 8 where you can actually deliver a baby. All of the acute care facilities where you can deliver a baby in America are on this side of the river. And that is problematic. So there's nothing that you're going to do to fix that. If you have a child at home that requires childcare and you have to go to a prenatal visit on the other side of the city, you're not going to get there. I operated on a 40-year-old woman with breast cancer shortly after coming back to Howard, and she didn't show up for her first day of chemotherapy. And they called me, and so I called her. And I called her, I must admit, getting ready to chastise her about how important it was to take her chemotherapy. And she calmly said, Dr. Frederick, I work by hourly wage. And when I don't show up, I don't get paid. And this month I had too many bills to go get my chemotherapy. There's no amount of medicine that I could give that's going to combat that issue. And that means that I did not do my job to find out what her issues were and to try to make sure that we had social services to support that. So oftentimes, the social determinants of health are very critical in terms of determining patients' outcomes.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Vi. I'm a senior chemistry major, and I'm actually reading a question from our Q&A chat. Hello, Dr. Frederick. How do you suggest pre-medical students work to combat their implicit biases as they prepare for medical school? Do you have any suggestions on resources to use to become more aware of disparities in healthcare? Thank you.
Yeah, and good question. I think one of the things that all of us have to do a better job of, and I think it will certainly help pre-med students, is we have to interact with other people who don't quite look like us. We have to make ourselves uncomfortable. Howard University has students from 46 states and 71 countries. And I tell students all the time that you can meet the entire world here, but you're not going to meet that entire world if you stick around the same people. And again, I don't say any of these things as preaching to you. I say it as a victim of it myself, as a culprit of it, I should say. I still sound like I'm from Trinidad because when I was here for undergrad, I hung out with the guys from Trinidad. I didn't go hang out with the guys from Cali or the guys from New York. And it was a very diverse place. But those comforts are what we go to, especially when you're away from home. But the reality is there's a lot more to gain by interacting with people that you could learn so much more from. And that's one of the biggest things that I think, not just pre-med students, I think all college students should do. Everything about your college experience is an opportunity to be a sponge before you get into that kind of rote living. And I think if you do it in college well, you won't do it when you get out into your work life. And it's probably the best thing that college offers. 20% of what you learn, you will learn in a classroom. 80% of the activity at a university, in my opinion, takes place outside of the classroom. And it's an invaluable experience, but it involves people. It involves interacting with other people.
So you had mentioned in your presentation that protests have served as a motivation and a sort of source of optimism. I'd like to push you a little bit on that and ask, in your both professional and personal life, have the protests affected you directly in your thinking? And as the president of Howard, has it changed university's stance or behavior in any way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I have to admit, I have some cynicism about protesting because I think we romanticize protesting, especially on my campus of all places, because we have a history of activism and protesting. And so what I try to make sure that young people are thinking about is making sure that there is something that comes at the end of that. And on the front end of that, why are you protesting? If you are not learned in the issue at hand, you are not ready to go protest about it. And I apply those principles to my kids. Like I said, my 14-year-old daughter is an attorney, she's an activist, but one of the first things we do when she has a bee in her bonnet is we research that issue to its tilt. And so, yes, it does affect what happens on my campus. So our homecoming is world renowned. It's a huge party, and this year it'll be virtual. And what I'm pushing our entire community to do is participate in an activity called Protest to Policy. In an election year, we should be very clear about what every issue is, every issue that people are protesting, what the Democrats think about it, what Republicans think about it, what some of the minor parties think about it, what are their policies, and we should be clear about it. I don't care how you vote. What I do care about is that you vote and that you vote in an educated fashion. So the most embarrassing moment for me is to take my daughter to the polls with me, which we always do, my wife and I do, and she will tell on us if we vote for a candidate that we don't know, that we simply know is of one party or the other because we might be voting down the ticket line. And she will call us on it. And I just don't think any of us should do that. And I think right now we have an opportunity to look at all the protesting that's taking place and make sure we understand it. So if somebody says we should defund the police, we shouldn't misinterpret what that means. We should be clear about what that means. We should look at what community policing means. We should educate ourselves. And I think especially for college students, you have no excuse not to be the experts in your community about all of these issues.
And has that translated into the teaching at Howard University as well? Is that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, without a doubt. The faculty are very much into that. As a matter of fact, the symposia on protest to policy, the faculty are going to lead that. And in a presidential election year, our freshman experience class is an example of that. So they're going to look at the voting system. They're going to look at the Voters' Rights Act. They're going to really educate students about those issues. For instance, even this discussion about mail-in ballots, they're going to look at the history of that. When did that come about? Which states have it and why? What are the laws that were passed to get there? But regardless of whether or not you're taking that class on our campus, we're encouraging people to do that. We have a book that we want everybody to read as well, for the entire campus. And so those are some of the things that we try to do. I'm currently, actually, as I'm sitting here, I'm currently reading Cast, by Isabel Wilkerson, who happens to be one of my alumni. And so, I think we all have a responsibility to continue to push ourselves and expand our minds.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kaylee. I'm an international studies major and I'm a freshman. I was wondering, what do you think the lasting effects of COVID-19 will be?
Yeah, I think there are going to be several lasting effects. There's going to be significant distrust in the medical system because of how we have politicized a vaccine. And I think we're going to have to do a lot as a country to get there. I think that there's going to be a lasting impact on how we socialize. I mean, I don't know about you, but I flew a lot, and when I would get on a plane and see somebody with a mask, you know, I would kind of look at them a little strange, you know. Now, if I go to the airport and I don't see somebody with a mask, I look at them very strange. And so just think about how much that has moved us. But having said that, I do think that the most important things that will come of it is I think your generation is actually going to be one of the most resilient generations. And I think that you're going to be a golden generation as a result of what you've gone through. And I think anytime you're faced with this much adversity at your age, you're going to appreciate your need to act and to get involved. And I think one of the lasting effects of the pandemic is going to be what people in your age do to change the world around you. I think there's a lot more of an impression that has been left on your generation, that you have a responsibility for each other, and that the change that you want to see will only come about from you exercising your talents and your knowledge towards the common good.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Trey Richardson, and I'm reading a question from the chat. How does Howard University address low standardized test scores among students of color that have an interest in attending undergraduate or graduate schools, as well as pursuing professional degrees?
Yeah, so that's a great question. But I want to give you a perspective on that. You know, I mentioned that we have 46% of our students Pell Grant eligible. When we look at SAT scores in particular, and I think that this is the type of point why you have to let data lead you to where it may go. African Americans taking the SAT who come from families who make 200,000 or more, and one of the recent tests about 3 years ago scored about a combined score in math and verbal of 971. Their white counterparts who came from families who made less than 20,000 scored 968, just like some 3 points less, despite that difference in the economics. So it's a culturally biased test. There's no doubt about it. However, at Howard, we have an unusual circumstance. Those Pell Grant students and low-income students who come to Howard have an average SAT score of over 1,200 and GPAs of 3.7. So they're very well prepared academically, and they do very well. And their biggest barrier is finances. But we still recognize that we want to make sure that we're providing access for others. So in the summer, we have a program at Howard where we bring students primarily from HBCUs, and we basically put them through, these are college students and undergrad, and we put them through MCAT prep, LSAT prep, and we just started GRE prep, and we do DAT prep for dental school. And the goal here is recognizing that those students don't always have the preparation, etc. We pay for them for housing. We have didactic sessions. They take a test every week. We give them test taking tips. And we also expose them in the circumstances where there's clinical work, we expose them to clinical opportunities as well, so that they can pursue medicine. And what we've seen early on is that their MCAT scores have gone up, their DAT scores have gone up, their LSAT scores have also gone up as well. And in the PhD, the pre-PhD program, we really are focused on getting more students into the humanities and social sciences, because unfortunately on our college campuses, I think we've done a disservice to America by de-emphasizing our social studies and humanities. And I still think that that's the bedrock, if not the backbone of our humanity at the end of the day in terms of solving complex problems.
Thank you very much.
Hi, so my name is Caroline LeBron. I'm a freshman. I'm a political science major. So obviously you were talking about like the disparities within our healthcare system, and there's a lot of disparities for people of color, especially Black women. Do you believe that these disparities are getting worse now because of the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, the disparities are getting worse. If you look at the time period of March 2020 to the end of June 2020, and you go and compare that to March 2019, through June 2019, what you will see is that there were more people who died in this March to June at home than died last year at home. And so that says a couple of things. One is that people were scared to go to the hospital, so their chronic illnesses have gotten worse in some circumstances. Clearly, some of them may have died from coronavirus, but the vast majority probably died from heart attacks, untreated, uncontrolled hypertension, and their diabetes, out of control, etc. Those chronic illnesses that we have not been taking care of are going to exacerbate and get worse. And I think what we will see over the course of the next 12 months is disproportionate outcomes, again, in those patient populations with those diseases like hypertension, heart disease, diabetes. And I think that that's just a reality. And that's something that our healthcare system, our public healthcare system, needs to be proactive about. We have to start going out and seeking those patients and trying to get them back into the system, as quickly as possible. I mean, something as simple as a flu shot, as an example, flu incidence should be down because all of you are wearing masks and washing your hands and keeping your distance. But the reality is that some of those patients can't afford to get the flu, and they still need the flu vaccine, and they probably are not going to get it. I have sickle cell. I'm a type 1 diabetic. And so I got my flu shot just yesterday, as an example. But a lot of those patients in those circumstances are not going to get it. And that's going to cause us to have another pandemic within the pandemic.
Thank you.
Hello. I have a question from the chat.
Sure.
For those of us that are having to do our courses from home, how would you recommend we stay motivated and focused to do well in our classes? It's easier to get sidetracked at home.
Yeah, it's difficult. And like I said, I see it with my 16-year-old and my 14-year-old, and I teach a class, I had to teach it online, and it's tough. It's tough to teach a class as well. So I can imagine how difficult it is to sit there and listen, just like you guys were so gracious tonight, as a matter of fact. But I think you have to involve yourself in other things. And what I've been trying to tell my kids is this is an opportunity for them to connect in different ways and to do things that they otherwise would not have done or felt would be mundane. So, whether it's going on walks, hiking, getting outdoors, doing something else. My daughter never played golf before, so she started taking lessons. I think you have to occupy your minds with other things as well. And I think that ultimately helps your schoolwork because you're more motivated to learn and to get things going. But your extracurricular activities have to be enriching. I don't care how smart you are and how dedicated you are to your schoolwork. I think the things that surround you, you have to create an environment around you that's exciting and enticing and find things that you're passionate about.
Hi, Doctor. I'm Cora, and I'm a senior social work student. And I particularly wanted to ask, and I think that you've kind of touched upon this a little bit, so I apologize if it's slightly redundant, but I was just hoping to get another answer from you. So I think that oftentimes people can feel a little overwhelmed by the amount of things that they'd like to change or, by the breadth of problems that they might notice. And so sometimes I think that they may shy away from their own ability to cause change. And I'm just curious, what, advice do you give maybe in your capacity as president of Howard University or as an educator? What advice do you give to young people who need to feel inspired?
Yeah, that's an absolutely great question, actually. So one of the things I think that the circumstance we live in today is that everybody feels a little less than if they're not clear about what they want to do. I spoke to a medical student just yesterday, actually. On my way home from work, I'd set up a call with him. He did not choose surgery until recently. He decided he wanted to do surgery, and he was concerned that he had failed the test, and he was concerned about every reason why he probably wouldn't be suited for it. And I said to him that, I don't think that you should get down on yourself about that. I think unfortunately, we really are pushing everybody to figure out what they want to do early and to push them to do that. Now, this goes a little bit against my BA-JD program, my BSMD program, but those are for the students who know they want to be there. But we have to make space for students who want to do other things. So on my campus, I don't ask students what their majors are. I ask them what their mission is, because that's what I think is important. And I think what I would encourage you to do, and other people who want to change the world, is just simply figure out what your mission in life is. And the simpler your mission is, the more complicated the things you do are going to be. And so my friends used to tease me all the time that I wanted to save the world. And I used to say to them that my mission was simple. I just want to save the world. And so how I go about doing that becomes more complicated and a lot more fun and interesting as well. So don't limit the things that you want to do just because you think you don't have the capacity, but rather dream and dream big, but be very clear about your mission. No major is going to get you to that, but your mission is going to get you to that fulfillment.
Thank you very much.
I'll invite any other students who might have questions or questions from the Q&A or the chat to bring forward your final questions. As you're thinking of those, I'll ask one. Last month, the Howard University community celebrated the historic nomination of Howard alumna Kamala Harris as a candidate for Vice President of the United States. Dr. Frederick, you called Senator Harris's nomination an extraordinary moment in the history of America and Howard University. Could you talk about what made this moment so extraordinary and so meaningful?
Yeah, I've gotten to know Senator Harris very well, and I consider her a friend. She called me the night before she was nominated, and her call, she had driven by the bookstore and called me to figure out if it was closed. And in her usual down-to-earth style, she called and said, "Mr. President, I'm just calling. I'm sorry to disturb you. I'm just calling to see if the bookstore is closed." And I said, "No, I don't think it's closed, but at the same time, I don't think I want you to go into the bookstore at this moment and, ask her what she wanted, et cetera." And so we had a little bit of a banter. I tell that story because the thing about her that I think is amazing is just she represents any one of you sitting in that room right now. She could sit in that room in any one of those chairs that you're in, and you wouldn't even know that she's potentially on her way to be the vice president of this country. She's very smart, high intellect, charismatic, motivated, determined, but very, very much a very down-to-earth person. And I think that there's a lot in that for us. So I felt that it was a historic moment because somebody who represents the most common of us has that opportunity. And that's what our government should be about. And I feel that she has the opportunity to, shatter a glass ceiling with a Howard hammer, I may add. And so she came here to get the truth, which you get in the classroom, as I was pointing out. But because our motto is truth and service, we always tell students that when you leave here, your responsibility is to go out and change the world around you. If you use your knowledge for yourself, then that's not what it's there for. It is to change the world around you. And so she epitomizes, our principles. Win or lose, I think her opportunity to step out on that stage from where she came, again, just represents exactly what America is about. And I think that in and of itself is something, regardless of what party you support or what your politics are, that we should all be proud of.
Is the health insurance system in the United States broken irrevocably, or is it a matter of reform?
So I have to give one of my disclosures here. I am on the board of Humana. So let me just put that out there before I answer this question. So nobody goes back and researches this after and says, wait a minute. And those of you who don't know, Humana is a health insurance company. Primarily look at Medicare Advantage is a program that we primarily provide. I don't think it's completely broken. I don't think that that's the case. And I don't think it's a health insurance issue that we have. I think we have a healthcare issue. I don't think that we appreciate the fact that we spend more money in the last year of life than we do on prevention. And that fundamentally is our problem in the American healthcare system. It is not a healthcare system, it's a sickness system. We do not try to make people well. Just think about the fact that if you had an insurance system that was just as focused on you going to the gym, on you walking a certain number of miles, and on decreasing your premium every time you did that on a quarterly basis, just how much better we would all be for that. And those are the types of things, the types of programs, and one of the reasons why I joined an insurance company like Humana, because I feel that that's what we should be focused on rather than paying for incidents of illness and trying to get people well. Those will be there, don't get me wrong, and we still need to do that. But we could do a much better job on the front end if we had a system that rewarded that behavior and rewarded it through insurance. And so we set premiums based on wellness activity that you were willing to participate in and demonstrate by your own results. So if you were overweight and you lost a certain amount of weight and your doctor verified that, and then the next year we give you a certain number of points that dropped your premium, and we kept bringing your premium down. I mean, what we focus on now is raising people's premium, and health insurance companies don't really push patients to get better, to get that down. And I think we just have to push for more wellness programs and a much better system that focuses on wellness.
Thank you. Last call for questions from the audience. Matt?
Hey, Dr. Frederick. In these times, how do you work to build something like international solidarity or an acknowledgement of how this is affecting people in different countries, especially with the global pandemic, which I feel like there's a lot of, like you said, a lot of politicizing, a lot of people blaming, even going as far to call something like this, like the China disease or something. So how do you go to break these stigmas, break those kind of boundaries?
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I think we must all do is to make sure that we don't normalize those things. I think one of the things that we have been doing as a society is normalizing what is extremely aberrant behavior, and we have to stop doing that. And I think we've almost doubled down on doing that. We've gotten comfortable with using certain language and even referring to each other in a certain way, or for that matter, even being dismissive of each other's ideas. And it's not just at the very top of our leadership in the country. Unfortunately, it happens on my campus, right? I tell people my campus is left of left. And while there's nothing wrong with that, it becomes problematic if somebody to the right can't come on this campus and have a conversation. I think that that's problematic. And I think that that's what our universities should be about. Our universities should be the cauldron of free thought, of debate, of robust, rigorous debate, regardless of what you think about an issue. And as a matter of fact, I would say for the young people in the room, when you think of those biases and so on, ask yourself, what is the source? What is the etiology of that bias? Where does that come from? And what can you yourself do to change that, right? So, you know, you can have that bias, but do you put yourself in an uncomfortable situation? So when I was training at MD Anderson, I was in a room one day with a Jewish surgeon, and I said to him, you know, it was a very complex case. It was getting a little tense. And I said to him, you know, what does kosher mean? And he kind of looked at me like, what are you asking me? Everybody knows what kosher is. Well, everybody says they know what kosher is, but we don't really know what kosher is if you're not Jewish, because you don't ask that question, right? One of the things about being smart is we never want to expose our ignorance. So we don't go ask people about the things we don't know. And so he showed me what it was, took me to a kitchen, you know, food store. I mean, it was amazing. I had no clue what kosher was. I have my CFO at Harvard is Jewish. Every time we have a Jewish holiday and he would go away, I could tell the rest of the team wasn't quite clear where he was going. Here we are historically Black college and university. We don't celebrate the Jewish holidays. And so one day I called him up and I said, when you come back from this holiday and you come to cabinet meeting, explain to us what kosher, what the holiday was about. And he was so excited. He went over the top. He came in with dishes, apples, honey, and he gave the full explanation. But it was fantastic because not only was he able to express his pride in his faith, but the rest of us learned something that we never knew before. And did that make the team dynamics better? Absolutely. You know, so when he goes for Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, while we're not the most educated, you know, folks about Jewish customs, I certainly know how the apple and honey is tasted. And I know what he's savoring and what he's doing, and that makes me that much more empathetic towards his life. And I think we all need to participate in that activity. And I think that's how you combat that issue. And I think same thing with the international situation. You don't have to travel to a far-flung country to understand and empathize, but you could do research, you could understand it, and the pockets of communities that are around you, you can interact with them. I know Niagara isn't too far from Toronto, and I know there's a big Caribbean population in Toronto. I've been there a couple of times myself. Haven't been to Caribana yet, but it's on my list. But you have an opportunity there to go and interact with some Caribbean folks as an example.
Hello. This isn't related to the topic at hand, but what's your favorite color?
It actually is related to the topic. It's blue. My Howard Bison blue.
I love that.
Hello, Dr. Frederick. My name's Julie. I'm representing the Accelerated Nursing Program. And thank you so much for coming out tonight and speaking with us. It sounds like Howard University has done a lot for its community and its students, and it really sounds like your role has really made a difference. So just a couple questions that I have. What would you say is the biggest barrier in undoing the unconscious bias that we have right now in the inequality, the inequity in today's physicians and healthcare providers in society in general? And then the other question I have is, what kind of message or what would you want to say to the other or rest of the institutions that are currently experiencing like ethnic and racial disparities?
Yeah, the biggest barrier to unconscious to the situation that unconscious bias creates is not acknowledging that we all have unconscious bias. We all have those biases, and the biggest problem I think is that we all don't spend enough time figuring out what that is and taking appropriate action to combat it. On your second repeat your second question for me, please.
Second question is like, what kind of message or what would you want to say to the rest of the institutions that are currently experiencing these racial disparities? Like right now you're talking about Black people, but what about institutions that are having like inequalities with other populations?
Yeah, I think it's an issue all around. I mean, there's gender inequality, there's transgender inequality, there's so many different things, as I said, in terms of the biases that are laid out, and so many populations that get marginalized. And I think that what institutions have to do is just be open and confront those things. I think transparency is the way to go. Like I said, on my campus, we have a bias against women. I'm the 17th man that has run this institution. So anytime I talk about my successor, I always refer to her as a woman. so that I can start infiltrating the consciousness of everybody that we need a woman president. 70% of my undergrads are women. And as I said, I had one woman dean when I started, and out of 13, and we got all the way to 10. So we all have our issues in some way, shape, or form. And what we have to do is to be open about confronting them and making change everyone to see.
Thank you, Dr. Frederick.
No problem.
Hi, my name is Mairead. I'm asking a question from the chat. What do you think of Ben Carson's comments on Black America?
Yeah, so you know, I can't qualitatively say that. I'll tell you a story actually, and sometimes when I give this talk, I actually tell the story, and it's funny that I didn't tonight, and somebody asked a question about Ben Carson. When I was a third-year medical student, because I had sickle cell, I was curious about, should I do surgery or not? Would I survive it? We had pyramid programs at the time, which means that 16 of us started, only 5 of us would finish. And so it was rigorous. There were no working hour rules as you have in medicine now. So I worked 110 hours a week, and having sickle cell, that was a challenge. You know, I've been in an operating room doing a case and have a sickle cell crisis and been in severe pain and stayed there because I felt like I had to. So I called Ben Carson up, who was at Johns Hopkins at the time. I was just a medical student at Howard. My mother loved him because of his books and his career. And, you know, I left a message with his secretary that I wanted to talk to him about surgery. I told her who I was and that I had sickle cell. And sure enough, I got a call back that I should come up to see him on such and such a date. And so I took the train up to Baltimore, got to his office. He just came out to the operating room in full scrubs and sat with me for 40 minutes and convinced me to do surgery. Now, that Ben Carson is not the same Ben Carson who makes those comments, in my opinion. But the reality is, as we're talking about bias, I could never talk about Ben Carson and not appreciate that he did that. I was not one of his medical students. I was a stranger from a totally different city. And at that time, he was at the zenith of his fame. He had separated Siamese twins in a way that nobody else had ever done before. And yet still, he took time to meet me, a lowly medical student. It's not like my dad called him, Dr. LaFord didn't call him, I called him myself. And he took the time to do that. So my point is that, you know, as people, we're complicated as well as human beings. And we also are complicated in phases of our lives as well. And so I don't agree with comments that he makes about Black people and so on, but I also know that he showed me an extraordinary amount of kindness and humanity at a time when I needed it the most. And so just like all the biases I was talking about today, I do have a bias that I have been the beneficiary of his kindness. I also have a bias that I don't agree with his points on Black America. I still talk to him today. I'm still friendly with him, but I disagree with him wholly. But I thought just to give you balance, I would tell you that story as well.
Thank you.
In just a moment, I'll invite our president, Father Marr, up to offer some concluding remarks. But first, one final question. And thank you, Dr. Frederick. You've been enormously generous with your time and with your insights. We are very, very grateful. People living through this moment in history, whether our students, members of our communities, or ourselves, have experienced horrific loss, grief, both personal and collective, uncertainty, fear. Do you have any words for those who might be losing hope to help stave off despair?
Yeah. You know, one of the things about the human condition that I love, and the reason that I think that I'm so obsessed about the journey of life, is the fact that we all have the capacity to love. That capacity to love is the ultimate hope in anything that we do. And so for those who are in despair, this is a difficult time. There's no doubt about that. But I hope that those people, even in their lowest moments, would either feel the love of someone else or appreciate the fact that they can extend love to someone else. And that's why, especially now, as we do the right things around social distancing and wearing masks, etc., we all have a responsibility to express that love for each other in the best way that we can. And so tonight, one of the things that we all can do as an example is to make sure that we go reach out to someone that we have not reached out to in a while, or to be that gracious to someone that we have no reason to be that gracious to. Just think about going into a store today in the middle of a pandemic and not just paying for your food, but paying for the person behind you without them knowing and leaving. I'll tell a story since this is not a Howard audience. I went into a department store in Virginia on my way to the airport one day, and a dental student came up to me and said hi and introduced himself and saw one of my dental students. I was shopping for some sneakers. They didn't quite have my size. I got something else, and I saw that he was looking at a similar sneaker. And I told the person, I gave them my credit card number and everything, and I told them to charge my card, for his sneaker. 2 days ago, today's Wednesday, so Monday, I'm in Starbucks here on campus, and a young man walks in and says, "Hi, Dr. Frederick." And I say, "Hi, how are you?" And then he comes over to me, not socially distancing, but his mask was on, and whispers in my ear, "Thanks for the Stan Smith." And then he went back and we spoke a little bit about where he was. And I have to tell you, I was floating on cloud nine when I left the Starbucks. I never thought I'd see him again. He probably never thought he'd see me again, but I felt good about that. And I didn't do it because I don't know anything about him, whether or not he could even afford those sneakers, but I just wanted to surprise him. And I just think that we have an opportunity every day to do so many of those little gestures, to say hi to somebody, to hold the door open, to ask someone how they're feeling. And I just think that those are the things that ultimately matter. And if we do enough of that, we could actually combat a lot of the despair that exists right now.
Thank you.
Father Mar?
Dr. Frederick, I just wanted to thank you for being with us this evening. I would just deliver this message to our students, how blessed we are to have you speak to us and share your life story and your experience and your wisdom and your faith. That's probably the most important thing that we can give to our students, as well as knowledge, but even the love that's underneath the knowledge. So we all know your competency. We know how accomplished you are. But what we feel tonight is your spirit and your goodness and your humanity. So on behalf of our community and our students, I thank you for being able to be with us and share the wonderful life story and journey. And we hope that when you come to Toronto, you'll come by to Niagara University and visit us on our campus.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. It has been a high honor for me to join you this evening. And I absolutely, on the first opportunity that I get, I am going to come and visit you in Niagara. And yes, I think the one thing that I have been given in an abundance is love. And I appreciate the fact that I have received so much of it from so many people, even when I haven't deserved it. So I have a responsibility to try to spread as much of it as possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And I just want to thank Professor Hinckley, Dr. Riley, and our unsung heroes, our IT folks who are here helping us to navigate this. So thank you, everyone, and have a great night. Thank you.